Hello there. How are you doing? It's good to see you again, my friend. Well, today's subject is going to be about compassion, and I'm going to give you a slightly different take from what most modern um, opinions are on this subject. I think that today compassion is basically understood to be acceptance or some form of tolerance, and perhaps tolerance is a factor in compassion, but Um, I think acceptance I think acceptance actually is probably a mistake from the perspective of compassion because I'm curious what the utility of that is. Um, you can think that perhaps somebody might feel love from a accepting kind of compassion, but it doesn't, in my opinion, really create the necessary stimuli for change. And I'm really not sure what the pragmatic utility is of compassion unless we're trying to invoke a change outside of certain things like perhaps compassion for those who are ill or compassion for those who are going through a tragedy. I think understanding and acceptance and things like that in those circumstances are probably warranted, um, at least initially. Eventually, probably life has to go on, but that's all very contextual, and I'm not going to go on and on about that. Transversely, I think it's also become very common, and perhaps this is because we use the same words for these things, to extend a sort of accepting and tolerant compassion for people whose circumstances are materially caused by their own behaviors. And for me, this is an error. This is not actually compassionate. This is perhaps facilitating behavior. This is perhaps actually causing people to be stuck in these patterns because you're not trying to elicit the change. You're not trying to create the development which will cause them to escape these circumstances which they are in. And so I think that it's important to be compassionate with a dash of judgment, which might be a funny sentence, but a sort of judgmental compassion. Um, well, this really actually creates the groundwork for um, opportunity, and it really is. It sets the scene, and the scene is, you know, I'm compassionate and tolerant right now, but that is a condition with an expiration date. That's what the judgment says. I don't accept you as you are, even though I pity your condition. And I think that on average, in our current culture, that is probably a more appropriate stance to take. Um, if we look at people who are struggling and we don't attempt to give them the tools to address their condition, and we don't actually tell them that they should address their condition and they should change, I actually don't find that to be very compassionate at all, especially if they're fully capable of doing the work. I wonder sometimes, have we gone so far down the line of um, the intellectual line of assuming that there was always a upstream causal source for the current condition? Have we forgotten that people have the ability to actually act on their own accords and fail to act of their own accord as well? Does our society remember that? Most of the greatness that was built in history, regardless of how you feel about it, was built on the back of men who took initiative and went after it. Have we forgotten that? As we look upon people who are in a particular way struggling or suffering, is there not a part of our mind that says they've chosen that? Are we so compassionate, or maybe the better word to use is accepting and tolerant, that we don't even realize that things could be better for that person if they wanted them to be? Now, of course, better is a gradient and better is subjective, but I think that there are some standards by which we mostly agree they could improve their lives. There are ways, if they tried harder, if they wasted less, if they cared more, if they wanted it, they could do more. We've also come to this sort of dichotomy in our culture where we've split desire from outcomes. We talk to people and they say, I want this, but I can't do it. Why? Why can't you do it? Why do we accept that? I've told my parents that many times when I was young, and it felt so true. But the truth was that I didn't want what they wanted for me. I wanted something else, and I didn't know what it was. But when they would ask me when I was young, "Don't you want this, or don't you want to be happy, or don't you want to be successful?" I would always say yes. Eventually, as they continued to ask me and continued to ask me, I would eventually start saying, "No, I don't care," which also wasn't true. Um, the truth is, as I've gotten older, I've come to peace with the fact that I just didn't want what they wanted for me. And I think that that's probably true of what most people are going through. They don't want one of the things that they believe are an option. And they may not be aware that there are alternative options. In that context, perhaps the more compassionate thing to do would be to explain the options. These are the things that you can do. You're going to have to do them, but these are the things that you could do. To remind people that they can do them, and maybe it's even compassionate to tell them that their suffering is their own fault. And I know that sounds rough, but in most cases it's true. Not going to say in all cases. Life can be brutally unfair. Let me rephrase that. Life is brutally unfair. I know that better than most. But again, I don't know that better than all. Many people know much better than I do that life is brutal and unfair. And in our context of history, I probably don't know that better than most because 36, I guess, at one point in history was probably about the average life expectancy for an adult male. So, whatever I get from this moment forward by historical context is extracurricular, so to speak. It is more than what most men received in their lives. And here I sit, smoking a cigar in an air conditioned room with beautiful bronze figurines around me, talking into a high quality microphone, looking at a high quality camera, surrounded by the great works of Western thought. And yeah, life is really pretty good for me. Um, I'm quite pleased with where I'm at. And you know what it took to get it? It took a lot of judgment and some hard lines being drawn, partially by my parents, partially by reality itself. And it took an acknowledgement of those things by me, And it took iterative, intentional activations across about 11 years. I will say about 11 years is how long it took to get here. And I've made quite a lot of very good decisions in the past 11 years. Um, I mean, really, about 11 years worth of consecutively better decisions. I kept getting better and better and better at making decisions until I finally got to where I'm at now. And I did a lot of learning in the first 6 of those years. Compassion is a contextual game, it's a balancing act. You have to give people the right amount of judgment to push them, but you have to give people the right amount of love to reassure them. It's really hard to do, especially when the person you're dealing with doesn't want to succeed, doesn't want to grow, doesn't want to develop. I would know I was that person for the majority of my young life. I used to be able to say for the majority of my life, and perhaps it's still true, although we're getting close to the point where I've lived about half of my life pretty assertive and powerful way. So it's almost no longer the case that I live most of my life as a depressed, cowardly weakling, but I did live a large portion of my life that way, and people were very concerned for me with good reason, and I made it through, and it did require both judgment and compassion, and perhaps that's the point of the video, is that it required compassionate judgment aimed at inspiring me to activate my freedom of will, which actually, um, that part was never actualized by the people who are trying to get me to do it, but I was able to do that on my own after I left, and they did help to create the conditions that pushed me into finally doing it. So, basically, I think that if you wanna be compassionate to people, you're probably going to have to be a little bit judgmental towards them. You're probably going to have to mix your, critique and your consolations, and try to give advice aimed at encouraging them to find their own path so that they can feel good about what they end up doing. And you're not going to be able to do it for them. You're not going to be able to seize control of the circumstance and change things so that they succeed. They're going to have to do it on their own. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So, with that, I will bid you a wonderful night. Thank you so much for watching. And we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much. Bye bye.